Ash the trash. That's what they called her in the break room, thinking she couldn't hear. She heard. She always heard. They didn't know she could identify a patient's entire service history from the way they moved, the limp of a roadside bomb survivor, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd held a dying friend. They didn't know that the quiet nurse clocking in at 2,100 hours at the VA clinic in San Diego had once held a field hospital together alone for 11 hours while rounds came in from 3 angles. By the time anyone noticed her, she was already invisible. Ashley Cooper moved through intake processing like water, finding the lowest point, efficient, purposeful, present but somehow not fully there. Her ID badge hung from a lanyard clipped to second-hand scrubs, the kind with permanent stains no amount of bleach could touch. Late 30s, dark circles under eyes that tracked 3 hallways simultaneously, her left hand moving with the economical precision of someone who'd learned that wasted motion costs lives. She processed veteran after veteran through intake, her voice soft but her question surgical. Name. Service dates. Branch. Combat location. Do you have pain? Where? Rate it 1 to 10. Have you eaten today? When was the last time someone asked you if you were okay? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like an insomniac's heartbeat. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and floor wax and the particular staleness that comes from a building where people carry their trauma through every hallway like luggage they can't set down. The tile beneath her feet was worn smooth from 30 years of boots and wheelchairs and gurneys. She'd been walking these corridors for 7 months, and not a single person on day shift knew her first name. At 02 for 5 hours, a Vietnam vet named Martinez came through with a chest X-ray showing something the radiologist had missed, a faint shadow in the right lower lobe that could be nothing or could be everything. Ashley positioned him for a better view, moved the light source, pulled the image up on the monitor. Her hand stayed steady. The tremor in her left hand only happened when she was alone, when she thought no one was watching, when the muscle memory tried to pull her back to a place she wasn't allowed to remember. She documented the finding, made a note for the attending, and scheduled a follow-up CT. By protocol. By the book. By every rule that kept her invisible. She noticed things the day shift nurses missed. The janitor had a new limp, left side, favoring his hip, probably a fall or a car accident, probably still making minimum wage and pushing a mop because he had no choice. The receptionist flinched at loud sounds, especially the overhead page system, hands trembling on the keyboard when it crackled to life. The locked drawer in Dr. Ashford's office that normally stayed open for file access had been locked since Thursday. She'd noticed that because she noticed everything. That was what happened when you'd learn to read an entire combat zone the way other people read a menu. Dr. Charles Ashford arrived at the clinic most days around 0700 hours and left by 1700. He was the kind of man who wore his privilege like cologne, silver hair styled precisely, a Rolex Submariner that cost more than some people's houses, shoes that probably had Italian names she couldn't pronounce. He moved through the clinic like he owned it, which in most meaningful ways, he did. Board certification. 23 years at the VA, publications in 3 respected journals. He didn't speak to the night shift nurses unless he needed something. He certainly didn't see them. But tonight he was still here at 02 for 5 hours, alone in his office with the door half closed. Ashley returned a misfiled patient record. Martinez's intake form had been routed to the wrong department, a simple error that happened maybe twice a month. She approached Dr. Ashford's office door with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent months becoming background noise. She raised her hand to knock, but the door swung open under the gentlest pressure, and what she saw stopped her breath in her throat. Dr. Ashford sat at his desk with a patient file open in front of him, the kind of file that should never leave the clinic, and his phone was positioned at the perfect angle for photography. The screen glowed in the darkness. He was scrolling through pages, full names, social security numbers, diagnoses, medication lists, prescription history, insurance information. Each patient a complete identity. Each file a person. His camera app was active. The files were being photographed. Being recorded. Being stolen. Their eyes met across 5 feet of office space, and time did what it always does in moments like that, it collapsed. Dr. Ashford moved with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd done this before. His hand slipped into his pocket. His expression shifted through surprise and into something colder, more calculating. The phone disappeared. The file stayed open on his desk as if it had always been there, as if it meant nothing. His smile arrived a half-second too late to be genuine. "Working late, Miss Cooper." The emphasis on Miss hung in the air like a threat. His voice was a tank idling in a garage, low, controlled, capable of tremendous force. Dedicated to the patient's IC. Ashley set the file on the corner of his desk without looking away. Her voice came out soft, the way it always did, the way it had to. "Martina's intake form. Misfiled. Returned it. I appreciate that." His eyes were still on her, calculating something. Very thorough. Very careful. She didn't nod. Didn't explain. Didn't apologize or clarify or defend. She simply turned and left, walking back toward intake processing with her heartbeat suddenly loud in her ears, her left hand shaking harder with each step. She kept it clenched against her thigh where no one could see. Where no one could read it as weakness. Where no one could use it against her. The night shift was quiet after that. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed louder, or maybe she was just listening differently now. She processed 3 more patients, documented their intake assessments, filed their records in the correct locations, performed every task with the same quiet precision. But something had shifted. Some silent alarm in the back of her brain, the part that had kept her alive in Helmand Province, the part that had learned to read people the way most people read faces, was now screaming that she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. At 0430 hours, when her shift ended, she walked to her locker in the break room. The locker was small, barely large enough for a change of clothes and a pair of surgical clogs. She kept it bare. No photos. No personal items. No evidence that anyone named Ashley Cooper existed outside these walls. But buried beneath the intake forms and the old schedule printouts, wedged in the corner where the metal had dented inward from careless force, was a single dog tag on a broken chain. She pulled it out. The chain was worn rough, the links tarnished from 7 months of being hidden, and the tag itself was scarred and scratched. But the name was still legible if you knew how to read it. If you understood what you were looking at. If you'd ever been the person it belonged to. My A. Cooper, it read. And below that, a service number no one was supposed to know. And below that, in smaller lettering that had been stamped years ago in a forward operating base, Helmand Province. She closed her hand around it. The metal was cold against her palm. Her fingers didn't shake when she held it this way, in private, in the dark. Her fingers only steadied. Only remembered. Only became what they had been trained to become. She pocketed the dog tag and left the break room without looking back. The parking lot was empty at 0 for 5 hours, just rows of vehicles under the San Diego sky and the particular silence that comes before dawn. She walked to her car, a 10-year-old Civic that asked no questions and drew no attention, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The dog tag sat in her palm. The chain had broken years ago, back when she'd tried to throw it into the ocean and her hands had refused to let go. Now it hung from her fingers like a question she wasn't allowed to answer. She'd been Major Ashley Cooper once. Combat medic. Decorated with distinction she couldn't speak about. Discharged under circumstances that were classified. Reassigned to civilian life with her record sealed and her identity scrubbed from databases she'd never know existed. The official story was a medical discharge. The real story was something nobody was supposed to know. But what happened next would change everything about that silence. The overhead PA system crackled to life at 7:43 in the morning. Ashley was restocking gauze packages in exam room 3 when the speaker hissed and a voice, deliberately loud, deliberately clear, cut through the clinic like a blade. Ash the trash, report to administration. Ash the trash to administration. The entire floor went silent. Hand stopped mid-motion. A veteran in the waiting room snickered. Someone's pen clattered on tile. Ashley set down the gauze with deliberate care, feeling the weight of 40 eyes tracking her movements as she turned toward the administrative wing. The fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz louder, or maybe that was just her pulse hammering against her ribs. The nickname had started the day after she'd walked into Dr. Ashford's office. A small thing. A weapon wrapped in false camaraderie. She'd absorbed it without flinching, the way she'd absorbed 17 years of army discipline, by making herself smaller, quieter, less visible. But small things compound. Small things build pressure. Dr. Ashford stood in the glass-walled conference room with the clinic director, Gerald Mitchell, gesturing as he spoke. His movements had the fluid confidence of a man accustomed to being believed. When Ashley entered, he didn't look at her. He looked at Mitchell, shaking his head with theatrical concern. "Miss Cooper has been struggling with the workload," Ashford said, his voice smooth as oil over water. "I'm recommending reassignment. The night shifts have worn her down. She's making errors. Patient safety is becoming a concern." A lie? Perfect. Constructed. The kind of lie that sounded reasonable to people who didn't know her. Mitchell nodded sympathetically. He was a good man, the director, genuinely cared about his staff. But he was also the kind of administrator who trusted doctors more than nurses, believed hierarchy more than evidence. The pen in his hand hovered over a pad. Ready to write the transfer request. Ashley stood perfectly still in the center of the room, absorbing the narrative being built around her. Her hands were steady. Her breathing measured. The way a soldier stands in formation while being reprimanded, present but removed, body here, mind elsewhere. She'd learned that trick in basic training and never unlearned it. But then something shifted. Something cracked behind her sternum. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. Not a sob. Not trembling. Just one tear, sliding like a traitor, like weakness made visible. She felt it happen before she could stop it. The room seemed to pause. Ashford's eyes flicked toward her for the first time. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact. Her hand moved from cheek to jaw in one deliberate motion, and when she looked back at Ashford, there was something different in her gaze. Something that made the air in the room shift, like pressure building before a storm, like the moment before a patient crashes and you know what's coming. "You'll regret teaching me what desperation looks like," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. But it was the kind of whisper that carries further than a shout. The kind that settles into bone. Ashford's jaw tightened. A muscle flickered near his temple. He hadn't expected her to speak. Nobody expected the quiet ones to speak. Mitchell looked between them, suddenly aware that something was happening beneath the surface, something he didn't understand. That afternoon, Ashley was alone in the supply closet, her hands deep in a cardboard box of 4 lines, when Ashford appeared in the doorway. He stepped inside without permission and closed the door behind him. The shelves around them were stacked with trauma shears, sterile gauze, packets of saline. The space was small. Intimate in the worst way. He stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that didn't match the predatory tilt of his shoulders, and the mint gum he was chewing. His breath, when he spoke, was careful. Controlled. "Your employment here is hanging by a thread," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "One more step out of line. One more time you're somewhere you shouldn't be. One more word spoken out of turn. And you're done. Do we understand each other?" Ashley's hands didn't move from the box. Her voice, when she answered, was barely audible. "Perfectly." He smiled then. The smile of a man who believes he's already won. He reached past her for a bottle of alcohol-based hand sanitizer, snapped the pump once, twice, and walked out without another word. The sharp chemical smell hung in the supply closet like a threat. The next morning, during shift change in the parking lot with the arriving day shift watching, 20 nurses, maybe more, all seeing exactly what Ashford wanted them to see, he made the announcement. His voice carried across the asphalt parking lot like a broadcast. "Ashley Cooper is being reassigned, effective immediately. Intake processing. The parking lot screening kiosk. A plywood booth. Normally reserved for probationary hires or administrative punishment. The kind of assignment that might as well say this person doesn't matter in letters 12 feet tall. She accepted the new badge from his hands without a word. The plastic was warm from his grip. When she turned it over, she saw the access restrictions: patient files, denied. Records room, denied. Treatment areas, restricted. He'd systematically locked her out of the infrastructure that made her valuable. But when she closed her fingers around the badge, her hand tightened until her knuckles went white. Not fear. Not anger. Something else. Something that felt like recognition. The feeling a soldier gets when they understand, finally, that they're in actual combat. The next 3 days were the architecture of a systematic dismantling. Maria and James, the two nurses she'd befriended over coffee, who'd asked about her son and invited her to a movie after work, both transferred to different rotations without explanation. Their lockers emptied during hours when she wasn't there. Her own locker was reassigned. The personal items inside, a photo of her son from 2 years ago, a thank you card from a veteran's wife, were boxed up and left on a chair with her name on the label. Her morning shift became night shift. Her night shift became split shift, 6 hours, break, 3 hours. The kind of schedule designed to isolate, to make continuity impossible, to ensure she wasn't working alongside anyone for long enough to build trust or alliance. Each change came with Dr. Ashford's signature on the scheduling system. She saw him through his office window, cordless phone pressed to his ear, his body language expansive and confident. He was building something. Making calls. Making moves. Meanwhile, Ashley started noticing a pattern in the veterans who came through the clinic. 3 of them had called back with the same problem: identity theft. Another 2 reported fraudulent credit cards opened in their names. One veteran, Thomas, Vietnam era, diabetic, came in monthly for wound care, pulled her aside in the waiting room and whispered that his VA benefits had been diverted to an account he didn't recognize. Thomas had cancer. Ashley had helped him fill out insurance forms 2 months ago. Ashford had accessed his file 17 times in the past week. She started documenting. A handwritten log on napkins and coffee shop receipts, tucked into her scrub pocket, then hidden in her car's glove compartment. Dates. Patient names. Ashford's access timestamps. The pattern was becoming undeniable, like a radiograph showing something spreading through tissue, metastatic and organized. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't tell anyone without explaining how she knew, and she couldn't explain without revealing that she'd been paying attention, investigating, moving through spaces she was supposed to stay out of. The worst part was that exposing him would expose her, and exposing her meant the tribunal generals would know she'd surfaced, that she'd broken the oath of silence they'd sealed with a redacted file and a scrubbed identity. Her 17-year-old son, Marcus, found her at 3 in the morning in the attic, sitting cross-legged on the plywood floor beside a shadow box she'd kept hidden for 4 years. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion, from the kind of bone-deep fatigue that came from holding yourself together while everything around you splintered. The shadow box held her medals, a bronze star with Valor device, a purple heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, a meritorious service medal, and underneath, wrapped in tissue paper, a Distinguished Service Cross. The decorations were real. The commendations underneath were real. The photograph clipped to the back, Major Ashley Cooper, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 2007, was real. Everything else was a lie. Marcus didn't turn on the overhead light. He just sat down beside her in the dark, his long legs folded awkwardly in the cramped space, and asked the question she'd been dreading for 4 years. "Mom, what did you do before nursing?" "I was a nurse," she said. He didn't believe her. She could tell by the way his shoulders dropped, the way his hand found hers and squeezed. But he didn't push. He was a good kid. He knew when to let people keep their secrets, even when those secrets were poison. That same morning, at 7:52, Dr. Ashford sat in his office with the door closed and made a phone call to the VA regional office in Phoenix. His voice was measured, professional, reasonable. "Yes, I'm Dr. Ashford at the San Diego facility. I'm calling about a staff member, Ashley Cooper. She's been with us for 3 years now, and I have serious concerns about her fitness for duty. I'd like to request an immediate transfer. Bakersfield would be appropriate. Yes, I have documented incidents. Yes, I understand the process. I can have the paperwork submitted by end of week." He hung up and smiled at the wall of his office. The smile of a man who understood leverage, who knew how to use the system, who had already calculated 3 moves ahead. What he didn't know was that inside her locker, hidden inside the hollow of a battered surgical manual, Ashley had kept a copy of his photograph taken on her phone. One shot of him holding his device up to a patient's file, the numbers visible, the intent unmistakable. One moment of carelessness, preserved forever. 3 days. That was all it took for Dr. Ashford to dismantle her world using nothing but policy and phone calls. The first reassignment came on a Tuesday at shift change. Maria Santos, the night shift wound care specialist who had brought Ashley coffee every morning for 8 months, was reassigned to pediatrics effective immediately. No explanation. No discussion. The assignment slip was already processed, already final. Maria's eyes met Ashley's across the break room, an apology without words, before she gathered her things and transferred to a different floor. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a thin, clinical white. Ashley nodded once and continued restocking the supply cart as if nothing had shifted. But it had. She could feel the scaffolding of her professional life beginning to crack. Wednesday morning, James Liu disappeared from the evening rotation. He didn't call. Didn't text. He showed up at 7 a.m. to collect his personal items from the nursing station because his new assignment had him starting nights at the clinic's auxiliary site 14 miles away, a facility so understaffed that he'd be working 3 12-hour shifts alone in a treatment room. Ashley watched him load his things into a cardboard box. He'd been the one who defended her after the PA announcement, who'd said in the break room loud enough for others to hear, "That was out of line, and everyone knows it." Now he avoided her eyes as he buttoned his coat. "You'll do good there," Ashley said quietly. "I didn't have a choice," James replied, and the weight in those 5 words told her everything. Dr. Ashford hadn't asked James to transfer. He'd made it impossible for him to stay. By Thursday, the pattern was unmistakable. Her access badge stopped working on the 3rd floor patient database. The memo cited access review protocols and provided no restoration timeline. Her shift rotation was altered so that she now worked intake processing, the lowest status position in the clinic, alone, with no cross-coverage, during the hours when the day shift was transitioning in. The scheduling was surgical in its precision. She'd be most visible and most isolated simultaneously. Most vulnerable to further public humiliation, most cut off from colleagues who might witness it an object. Ashley stood in the break room at 6:44 a.m. on Thursday, reading the revised assignment sheet for the 15th time, and understood what was happening. This wasn't bullying anymore. Bullying was emotional. This was strategic. This was a man protecting something. Dr. Ashford wasn't trying to break her psychologically. He was trying to silence her institutionally. By the time anyone thought to ask Ashley about the patient records he'd been photographing, she would have no credibility left. She'd be the isolated intake nurse, the one nobody worked with, the one nobody trusted enough to ask to lunch. She'd be a ghost moving through the clinic, visible but untouchable. Even if she spoke, who would listen? The realization sat in her chest like a stone. She'd survived Helmand Province by reading intent. By understanding that military operations weren't random chaos but carefully orchestrated sequences designed to achieve specific objectives with minimum resistance. Dr. Ashford was conducting an operation. The objectives were clear: remove her support network, restrict her access to information, position her where she couldn't be heard, and ensure that by the time the actual threat surfaced, she'd already been professionally destroyed. That was competent. That was dangerous. Ashley returned the assignment sheet to the bulletin board and clocked in for intake processing, working alone in a small processing room near the parking lot entrance. The room smelled like old coffee and the distinctive chemical tang of hand sanitizer, industrial strength, the kind that left her knuckles perpetually dry. Rain had started during her drive-in, the kind of California rain that felt personal, that hammered the small window of her processing station in irregular bursts. For 6 hours, she checked insurance cards, verified addresses, and documented arrival times. Intake processing was work that required presence but not thought. It was work that positioned her exactly where Dr. Ashford wanted her, separated from the medical staff, removed from patient care, unable to access the systems that would show his crimes. It was work that could be documented, quantified, used as evidence that she'd been demoted. Demoted not for insubordination, but for resource optimization and departmental restructuring. Her hands moved through the motions with the same measured precision she'd used to maintain composure through the PA announcement. Check card. Verify spelling. Enter data. Next patient. The repetition was its own form of meditation. Each action was correct. Each action was documented. Each action proved she was complying with the system even as the system worked to destroy her. Around noon, Dr. Ashford walked past the intake window. He was carrying a folder, probably fabricated documentation, probably a formal complaint about her unauthorized scope expansion or some other invented violation to further justify her reassignment. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't need to. The message was already delivered in the shape of an empty break room and the weight of knowing that every colleague who might defend her had been systematically moved out of proximity. What they didn't know was that Ashley had started documenting the reassignments. Thursday afternoon, when her intake shift ended, she'd sat in her car for 8 minutes and recorded the details in her personal phone notes. Maria reassigned Tuesday 06 for 5 hours. James Liu transferred Wednesday 1900 hours. Database access revoked Thursday 0615 hours. Timestamps. Dates. The objective facts of a dismantling. She'd learned in Helmand that evidence was survival. Documentation was armor. The next 3 days followed the same pattern. She worked intake alone. She watched colleagues avoid her in the hallways, not from malice, but from fear. Nobody wanted to be next on Dr. Ashford's transfer list. Nobody wanted to be marked as loyal to the woman who was clearly falling out of favor. The clinical isolation was almost worse than the public humiliation had been, because at least the PA announcement had been sudden, a moment of violence that was over. This was slower. This was relentless. This was a man who understood that you didn't need to shout to make someone disappear. By Sunday evening, the weekend shift was operating without her at all. Her name had been removed from the rotation entirely. She was scheduled only for Monday through Wednesday intake processing, alone, in the parking lot building, in the room that smelled like old coffee and defeat. She'd been at the VA clinic for 4 years. She'd earned certifications in trauma care and infection control. She'd mentored new nurses. She'd stayed late to help struggling colleagues. She'd never called in sick. Never complained. Never asked for anything except to be allowed to do the job she'd chosen. 3 days of phone calls and policy memos had erased all of it. Ashley sat in her car in the parking lot at 5:27 p.m. on Sunday night, rain still hammering the windshield like it had something to prove. The dog tag on the broken chain pressed against her collarbone underneath her scrubs, the only evidence that Major Ashley Cooper had ever existed. She held it there with one hand, the metal cold against her skin, and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of stillness. 3 minutes where she didn't have to maintain composure. 3 minutes where the weight of her own invisibility could be actual, physical, something she could almost hold in her hands. Then she started the engine and drove toward home, toward the parking garage, toward the moment when everything would change in ways she couldn't yet predict. What she couldn't know, was that the bus stop 3 blocks from the clinic was about to become the fulcrum of her entire existence. What she didn't know was that a ranger with a punctured lung and a brother commanding a carrier group was about to make her visible in ways she'd never intended to be. What she didn't know was that the next 72 hours would dismantle Dr. Ashford's careful operation and set off a chain of consequences that would reach all the way to the FBI's field office in San Diego. All she knew was that she was still breathing. All she knew was that the system was trying to bury her, and she was still breathing. That would have to be enough. The fluorescent lights of the parking garage didn't turn on until motion sensors detected her, and Ashley sat in that darkness for so long that when the lights finally flickered to life, they felt like an accusation. 5 in the morning. She'd worked a double shift, 16 hours on her feet, running bloods, changing dressings, holding the hand of a 73-year-old Marine who'd forgotten his daughter's name but remembered hers. Just a nurse. That's what the VA clinic wanted her to be. That's what the paperwork said. That's what the system could erase in a single afternoon if she gave it a reason. The bus stop was 3 blocks from Seattle General, the one on 5th and Harbor where the city's forgotten people gathered before dawn. Ashley stood there at 6:15, still in her scrubs, still wearing the badge that was no longer hers, sweat cooling on her spine and her hands shaking with something that wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. It was the kind of bone-deep tired that came from pretending to be smaller than you were, quieter than you needed to be, less dangerous than the evidence hanging against your ribs in a dog tag on a broken chain. The bus was late. They always were. A man stumbled around the corner at 6:28. 50, maybe, wearing a torn shirt and jeans that had blood on them, old blood, dark and dried. He moved like someone who'd been hit hard and kept going anyway, which meant his body didn't know yet that it had been destroyed. Ashley recognized the walk. She'd seen it in field hospitals when men tried to stand on legs that weren't there anymore. He made it 6 feet past her before the bleeding restarted. The wound opened on his left side like something tearing through fabric. A sucking chest wound, air hissing in and out of the cavity with each breath, the telltale sound of pneumothorax. Delayed bleed from a bar fight, maybe, or 3 days of walking around with a stab wound sealed only by blood and luck. His body folded. He hit the concrete hard enough to knock the air out of his lungs, which was mercy because the air wasn't reaching them anyway. A woman with a phone was already filming. So was a teenager. So was a man in a suit checking his watch like the bleeding was inconvenient, like a human being collapsing at a bus stop was just part of the commute. Their phones glowed in the early light, capturing the moment he stopped being a person and became content. Ashley moved. The homeless veteran sleeping 3 feet away had an MRE pack from the VA clinic. She recognized the packaging, the military-issue tan that never quite blended into civilian life. His name tag said Cooper, which was the kind of coincidence the universe offered to people who were running out of time. She took the MRE wrapper without asking, her hands already moving before her brain caught up, and by the time she was kneeling beside the bleeding man, she'd torn open the plastic and pressed it against the wound. The wrapper was waterproof. Designed for field rations, designed for survival, designed by people who understood that you had to seal things or they leaked. She pressed it against the wound and felt the air stop hissing. The sucking sound faded. His breathing changed, shallow, but moving. The next breath came easier than the first. Muscle memory took over. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She was a major in the United States Army, standing in a field hospital in Helmand Province with an RPG round screaming through the roof and 18 wounded men depending on the hands that had learned to do this in the dark. The hands that had learned to save people when there was no equipment, no backup, no mercy, just time and blood and the knowledge that hesitation was death. She pinched the wrapper closed at the top, creating a one-way valve. Air could escape. Blood couldn't get back in. It was field medicine, not elegant, not perfect, but it was enough. The man's oxygen saturation was probably dropping, but his lung was inflating again, which meant his heart had something to pump around. Which meant 60 seconds of life instead of 30. "Call 911, she said to the woman with the phone. The woman kept filming. "Call 911 now." Not a request. A command in the voice of someone who had ordered men to move under fire, and they had moved, because that voice didn't accept refusal. The phone came down. The 911 call took 40 seconds. The ambulance arrived in 4 minutes 43 seconds, and by then Ashley had positioned the man on his side, had kept the wrapper sealed, had talked him through the breathing that was working now, finally, the chest that was moving with air instead of filling with blood. The paramedics took one look at her handiwork and the precision of her movements, and something changed in their faces. Recognition. Not of her face, she'd never met them, but of the kind of competence that only came from training that civilians didn't have. One of them muttered into his radio as they loaded the stretcher, male, mid-50s, stab wound left side, improvised chest seal in place, vital stable. He paused. Radio ahead. This one's military trained. The SEAL work is too good. The ambulance left. The bystanders dispersed. The homeless veteran whose MRE she'd stolen was gone, which meant either he'd never been there or she'd imagined the symmetry of sharing a name with him. The bus finally arrived. Ashley didn't get on it. She walked back to the clinic instead, moving through the parking garage as the sun came up, turning the concrete the color of old bone. Her phone buzzed at 7:15. Then 7:40. Then a series of rapid-fire calls that she didn't answer, all from Seattle General's main line. By the time she pushed through the clinic doors at 8, the word had reached them. Army Rangers. Helicopters. A man in a hospital bed asking questions about the woman who'd kept him alive at a bus stop. Dr. Ashford was waiting for her in the parking lot. He had security with him, two men in dark uniforms with that flat expression that came from learning to not see anything inconvenient. His arms were crossed. His watch caught the morning light, a Rolex that cost more than Ashley made in a year, a piece of jewelry designed to announce that he was the kind of man who could afford consequences. "Miss Cooper," he said, and his voice had teeth in it now. The patient smile was gone. "We need to have a conversation about scope of practice." Ashley set her bag down. "You performed emergency medicine on a civilian outside this facility," he continued, moving closer. "Without authorization. Without supervision. Without regard for liability or insurance coverage or the fact that you are not licensed to practice medicine, you're licensed to assist with it." She didn't respond. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The dog tag against her ribs was steady, the only thing in her body that wasn't trying to lie about who she was. "That man could sue this hospital," he said. "He could claim you caused him additional injury. You've exposed us to millions in liability." He produced an envelope from his jacket. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Unauthorized medical intervention outside your scope of employment. Your badge, please." She unclipped it. The plastic was warm from her body heat. She placed it in his palm, and his fingers closed around it like he'd won something. Security escorted her across the parking lot at 8:37 in the morning, and the day shift was arriving. She could see the nurses through the windows of the break room. Maria looked away. Chen stared down at her coffee. Jackson's jaw clenched, which meant he understood what he was watching, the execution of someone who'd refused to be invisible. In her car, engine dead, head on the steering wheel, Ashley sat with her fists clenched so hard that her dog tag cut into her palm. Blood, small and clean, where the chain had bitten down. She couldn't go backward. The trafficking network she'd testified against had reach, had memory, had the kind of patience that lasted decades. The moment she surfaced as Major Ashley Cooper, she became a target. She couldn't go forward. This was what happened to women who saved lives without permission. This was the cost of hands that moved on their own, of instincts that wouldn't stay buried, of the kinds of competence that made bureaucrats afraid. She couldn't explain. She couldn't tell them why she had to do it, why the man bleeding on the concrete was worth the price, why some orders couldn't be followed even when obedience was the only thing keeping you alive. 2 hours passed. 3. The parking garage lights flickered on again as the afternoon failed toward evening, and still she didn't move. The tap on the window came at 11:47 a.m. Marcus stood there, 17 years old and carrying himself with the particular gravity of a military child who'd learned to read disaster in his mother's silence. In his hands was the shadow box from the attic, burnished wood, glass front, the medal she'd earned catching the light like accusations. He didn't speak. He just held it up where she could see. Her engine was dead. Head on the steering wheel. 2 hours she'd been sitting in the parking garage at Seattle General, engine off, lights off, completely still. The concrete around her was cold and grey, and the only sound was her own breathing and the distant ping of cooling metal. Her right hand was clenched so hard around the dog tag that the broken chain had cut into her palm, drawing a thin line of blood. She didn't move. She didn't uncurl her fingers. The pain was information. That's what they'd taught her in Helmand, and right now the only information she needed was whether she could still feel anything at all. The tag bit deeper. Good. At least that was real. The parking garage door opened. Footsteps. Young footsteps. Fast. Marcus didn't knock on the window. He just opened the passenger door and sat down with the shadow box on his lap. The box was mahogany, 14 by 10 inches, with glass front and brass corners, and inside it was everything the army had tried to erase. He'd driven to the attic storage unit before work, found it wrapped in a plastic bag behind the Christmas boxes, and brought it straight here because somehow he knew that's where she'd be. 17 years old, and he already moved like a soldier. "You're Major Ashley Cooper," he said. Not a question. She didn't move. "Your name is Major Ashley Cooper, and you saved a man's life yesterday and they fired you for it. And I'm tired of watching you pretend you're nobody." He opened the box. The medals caught the fluorescent garage light and threw it back like tiny spotlights. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Distinguished Service Cross. These are real. You're real. And Dad's right, you never told us, but that's who you are. Ashley's fingers finally uncurled. The dog tag fell into her lap, leaving a crescent-shaped indent in her palm. Blood pooled in it like a tiny red coin. "I can't," she whispered. "Mom." His voice didn't crack. "Yes, you can." 43 minutes later, the shadow box was sitting on the conference table at Seattle General's administrative wing, and the room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Dr. Richard Ashford was mid-sentence when Marcus walked in and said it, "My mother is Major Ashley Cooper." The VA regional director blinked. Sarah Chen, the nurse Ashley had trained 3 years ago, turned and saw Ashley standing in the doorway. Her hands went to her mouth. Admiral James Martinez, who'd arrived from San Diego Naval Station with his brother's medical records and a lot of questions, went completely still. The kind of still that comes from 18 years of command, from having given orders that cost lives, from knowing exactly what he was looking at. Ashford stood up. "This is a personnel matter. This meeting is." "Combat Action Badge," Sarah read aloud, her voice shaking as she pulled the personnel file Marcus had brought with him. The official file. The sealed file. Meritorious Service Medal. Deployment to Helmand Province, 2019 to 2021, attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Medical Operations. She looked at Ashley. "This is real." The regional director's face had gone pale. He turned to Ashford. "Dr. Ashford, are you aware of who this woman is?" "She's a nurse who violated." "Bronze Star with Valor," Admiral Martinez said. His voice came out like a command, like he was calling a ship to quarters. "Purple Heart. 2 of them." He stepped closer to the shadow box. "And a Distinguished Service Cross for actions during combat operations in Helmand Province. For holding a field hospital alone. For 11 hours. He looked at Ashley directly. "For saving 18 lives when your convoy was ambushed." The room didn't just go quiet. It inverted. The silence became a physical thing, a presence, like someone had opened a door and all the air had rushed out. Sarah's hands were trembling as she read the next line. "It says here she was recommended for commendation by her commanding officer. That her medical intervention saved lives under active fire. That her expertise in trauma surgery," she stopped. Her eyes were wet. "That her expertise was rated exceptional." "How is this possible?" the regional director asked. "Why is none of this in her employment file?" Ashford's jaw had tightened. The composure he'd carried for 3 years, the smooth administrative cruelty, the calls to regional offices, the reassignments designed to isolate, it was cracking. He was looking at Ashley now with something that might have been fear. "I was ordered to disappear," Ashley said. Her voice was flat, medical, the way she spoke when she was explaining a procedure to residents. "I testified in a closed military tribunal about what we found in Helmand. A trafficking network. I was ordered sealed for my own protection. My records were burned. My identity was deleted. I was given a new social security number and told to never surface." She pulled the dog tag chain from her pocket. The metal caught light. "This is the only thing I kept. The only proof I was ever real." Admiral Martinez's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Major, when did you stop active service?" 3 years ago. The tribunal happened. The order came down. I left the army the same week my records were scrubbed. And you've been hiding since." "I was told to hide." The Admiral stepped forward. His uniform was dress blues with ribbons that climbed his chest like vines. When he moved like Ashley moved, with the fluid precision of someone who'd made life and death decisions and had to live with them. "Major, I need to tell you something. The individuals you testified against were convicted on your evidence 18 months ago. Life sentences. Naval Intelligence confirmed the convictions 3 weeks ago when I started asking about a nursing candidate who saved my brother's life with combat medicine at a bus stop. He let that land. You've been erasing yourself to hide from ghosts." Ashley's knees buckled. Marcus was there instantly, his hand on her arm, steadying her like she'd taught him to steady patience. "She's been smaller for 3 years. Quieter. Less. Because she was hiding from people who no longer existed." One of the 2 FBI agents who'd been standing against the back wall stepped forward. She was holding a laptop. "We've been tracking Dr. Ashford's activity for 8 months. Medical record sales to 3 separate identity theft rings. He was photographing patient information and selling it for $1,200 per file. When he realized this employee might report him, he began constructing a termination paper trail. The fabrication attempts created a digital footprint that connects him directly to the purchasers." She turned the laptop around. Ashford's emails were on the screen. Photographs of patient records with price tags. Forwarded to accounts in the Cayman Islands. He committed fraud to cover a crime, which gave us probable cause. He's being charged with federal wire fraud, identity theft conspiracy, and healthcare record theft. 2 other agents moved toward Ashford. They didn't touch him. They just stood there, and he understood. He stood up on his own, and they placed handcuffs on him with the same efficiency Ashley used placing fur lines. Not rough. Not gentle. Just competent. Sarah was crying now, not bothering to hide it. "We documented everything. Every reassignment he made. Every patient file he accessed. Every call he made to transfer you." She looked at the regional director. He was isolating her. Building a case to make her look unstable before she could piece together the theft. The regional director turned to Ashley. His voice was very careful. "You cannot remain hidden anymore. Dr. Ashford's arrest will be public record. Your name will surface in the federal investigation regardless of your consent. The question is whether you reclaim your identity on your terms or whether you have it exposed on someone else's." Ashley looked at Marcus. Then at Sarah. Then at Admiral Martinez, who was standing with his hand over his heart in a casual salute, the kind of salute that carries the weight of 300 years of military recognition. Then she looked at the shadow box with the medals inside. The medals were real. The training was real. The lives she'd saved were real. Staying small had kept her invisible, but it had also kept her dead. She took the box from Marcus's hands. She held it against her chest. "My name is Major Ashley Cooper. I served in the United States Army. I served in Helmand Province with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. I held a field hospital for 11 hours when my convoy was ambushed. I saved 18 lives under fire. And I'm not hiding anymore." The words came out quiet, but they carried like commands across water. 6 months later, Ashley stood in an office in Washington, D.C. with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pentagon. The nameplate on her desk read Major Ashley Cooper, Deputy Director, VA Whistleblower Protection Division. The dog tag hung from her neck on a new chain, proper chain this time, military grade, the kind meant to last decades. The shadow box was mounted on the wall behind her desk. The medals caught light every time someone opened the office door. On her desk was a photograph of Marcus in his ROTC uniform, grinning like a man who'd never had to doubt his mother existed. Next to it was a case file from a nurse in Phoenix who'd discovered her hospital was selling patient records to the same identity theft rings that had paid Ashford. Ashley opened the file and began to read, her hand steady, her mind already moving through the process of protection and exposure and justice. In San Diego, outside a Ralph's supermarket on a Tuesday afternoon, Dr. Richard Ashford sat at a folding table with brochures for supplemental insurance spread across the surface. His medical license had been revoked. His house had been seized to pay restitution. His expensive watch, the one he'd worn like armor, was gone, replaced by a plastic digital watch from a pharmacy. The ankle monitor they'd given him glowed softly beneath his left sock. A veteran he'd once dismissed as a drunk walked past, recognized him, and spat directly at his feet. Ashford didn't react. Couldn't react. He was a ghost now too. At Fort Bragg, Major Ashley Cooper stood in full dress uniform, the first time she'd worn it in 3 years, and pinned a commendation medal on the chest of a young Army medic who'd exposed equipment fraud in her unit. The medic was crying, trying not to cry, the way soldiers cry when they're in public. "How did you find the courage?" the medic whispered. "They told me to keep my head down." Ashley touched the dog tag around her neck. The metal was warm from her skin. "I didn't find it," she said quietly. "I remembered I never lost it." That evening, she met Marcus for dinner in D.C. A quiet restaurant, the kind with white tablecloths and waiters who understood when people didn't want to talk. They ordered. They ate. And then Marcus asked the question she'd been waiting for. "What do you tell people now?" he asked. "When they ask what you did before the VA?" Ashley smiled. A real smile. The first one in 3 years that reached her eyes. "I tell them I was a major in the United States Army. I served in Helmand Province. I saved lives under fire. And then I learned that true class is what you do when the lights go out." Marcus raised his glass, red wine, the kind she actually liked, the kind she was finally allowing herself. To Mom, who never stopped fighting. To being seen, Ashley said. They drank. Through the restaurant windows, the Washington Monument glowed pale gold in the twilight, and for the first time since she'd buried herself 3 years ago, Major Ashley Cooper existed again. Not in secret. Not in fragments. Not erased. Real. If you found yourself thinking about what you would do in Ashley's position, if you'd have the courage to reclaim your own identity, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?